The drip, drip, drip of the leaky faucet was more than just an irritating noise. It was a soundtrack to Emma's lonely days, an audible reminder of everything she'd tried to ignore. The long stretches of silence in the house, the empty dinner table, and the stack of unread texts from Mark. Her husband was always busy, at work, on a flight, in a meeting, and his promises to spend more time together had become as unreliable as the kitchen plumbing. Emma wiped her hands on a dish towel and crouched under the sink, glaring at the mess of pipes as if sheer willpower could fix the leak. Water pooled at the base of the cabinet, threatening to soak into the wood. She twisted a valve with determination, but it wouldn't budge. Her hand slipped, and cold water splashed onto her shirt. "Perfect," she muttered, tossing the wrench aside. Resigned, she reached for her phone and scrolled through a local service directory. After a few taps, she found Jake's Plumbing Services, the top-rated company in town. She hesitated for a moment before dialing, vaguely aware of the unspoken pride she felt about managing the house on her own. But this was beyond her expertise. The call was brief. The man on the other end sounded calm and confident, his voice steady with a hint of warmth that made Emma feel less embarrassed about her inability to fix the issue herself. "I can swing by this afternoon," Jake said. "I'm wrapping up a job nearby." Emma glanced at the clock. It was barely noon, and she had the rest of the day to herself, just like every other day. "That works," she said, her tone polite but detached. After hanging up, she sighed and looked around the kitchen. The clean, sterile space mirrored the rest of the house, neat, orderly, and painfully quiet. It wasn't that Emma didn't love Mark, she did, in her way. But their lives had grown so far apart that she sometimes felt like a ghost in her own marriage. He was always working, always providing, always planning for a future that seemed to have no space for her in the present. By mid-afternoon, Emma had almost forgotten about the plumber until the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway caught her attention. She opened the door to find a man in a dark blue uniform stepping out, toolbox in hand. Jake was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that filled out his work shirt and a faint scruff along his jawline. His hair was tousled, and his smile was easy, unassuming, yet somehow magnetic. "Mrs. Parker?" he asked, glancing at the clipboard in his hand. Emma nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Just Emma is fine," she said, feeling awkward under his steady gaze. Jake set his tools down and crouched by the sink, his movements deliberate and efficient. "Looks like a pretty standard leak," he said, glancing up at her with a grin. "Shouldn't take more than an hour." "Great," Emma replied, folding her arms and leaning against the counter. She didn't know what else to say, so she watched him work, grateful for the distraction. As Jake twisted pipes and adjusted valves, he made small talk, asking about the house and how long she and her husband had lived there. His tone was casual, but Emma couldn't help noticing how he occasionally glanced her way, his eyes lingering just a second too long. "It's a nice place," Jake said, tightening the last bolt. "Quiet." "Almost too quiet," Emma admitted before she could stop herself. Jake looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes quiet can be lonely." Emma froze, unsure how to respond. She hadn't meant to say anything revealing, but there it was, hanging in the air between them. She forced a smile and changed the subject, asking if the pipes needed replacing. Jake let it go, but the moment stayed with her. By the time Jake finished, the kitchen was back to normal, the faucet running smoothly without a single drop out of place. He packed up his tools and handed her an invoice, his fingers brushing hers briefly as she took the paper. The touch was innocent, but it sent a ripple through Emma she didn't expect. "Thanks for calling me out," Jake said, his smile warm. "Let me know if you need anything else." Emma nodded, her voice catching slightly as she replied, "I will. Thanks, Jake." She watched from the window as he climbed into his truck and drove away, his silhouette disappearing down the street. The house felt emptier than ever. Emma shook her head, scolding herself for letting her mind wander. Jake was just a plumber, a professional doing his job. She was a married woman, and whatever fleeting thoughts had crossed her mind were just that, fleeting. Still, as she went about her evening routine, she found herself replaying their brief interaction. She noticed how her pulse had quickened when Jake smiled, how his voice seemed to fill the void left by Mark's absence. It was silly, she told herself, a one-time encounter, nothing more. But deep down, she couldn't deny the tiny spark Jake had left behind, a spark she hadn't felt in years. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the faucet Jake had fixed the day before. Emma stood by the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Her mind wandered to the fleeting interaction with the plumber, his easy smile and casual confidence still lingering in her thoughts. She shook her head, chastising herself for focusing on something so trivial. But the spark he'd left behind was undeniable. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her back to reality. She glanced at the screen. It was Jake. "Hey, Emma, it's Jake. I wanted to follow up on that sink repair. Sometimes those fixes don't hold, and I wanted to make sure everything's still running smoothly." The text felt unusually personal for a follow-up. Emma hesitated before responding, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, she replied with a simple, "It's working fine, thanks for checking." The message was neutral enough, but her heart raced as she hit send. Why? It was a harmless exchange. Still, she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened when she saw his name light up her phone. Later that week, another issue arose. This time, it was the shower in the master bathroom. Emma stood in front of the mirror, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, debating whether to call Jake again. She could call someone else, but Jake had done good work, and he'd seemed genuinely kind, and if she was honest, she wanted to see him again. When she finally dialed, his voice was warm and familiar. "Emma, hey, what's going on?" "The shower's acting up, it's not draining properly." "It sounds like a clogged pipe," he said. I can swing by later today if that works." Emma glanced at the clock. "Sure, that'd be great." She spent the next few hours tidying the house, her movements hurried and slightly frantic. She caught herself checking her reflection in the hallway mirror more often than usual. The realization made her pause. Why did it matter how she looked? Jake was just the plumber. Still, she swapped her usual sweatpants for a casual summer dress and let her hair down just in case. When Jake arrived, his presence filled the space as effortlessly as before. He greeted her with the same warm smile, his eyes flickering briefly over her before settling into a professional demeanor. "This the shower?" he asked, gesturing toward the bathroom. Emma led him inside, feeling hyper-aware of the close quarters as they stood together in the small space. Jake crouched by the drain, examining it with practiced precision. "You were right," he said after a moment. "Just a clog. Shouldn't take long to clear." Emma leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. She tried to focus on making conversation, but her mind kept drifting to the way his forearms flexed as he handled his tools, the faint line of sweat on his brow. "Do you always follow up with clients the way you did with me?" she asked, half teasing. Jake glanced up, his expression softening. Not always, but you seemed. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't know. Like you could use someone checking in. Emma's cheeks flushed. What makes you say that? Jake sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. Just a feeling. You mentioned it was quiet around here. I get that. Sometimes it's nice to have someone ask how you're doing. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she craved that simple acknowledgement, that someone noticed her, even in passing. I appreciate it, she said quietly. Jake smiled, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink. Emma quickly turned away, busying herself with straightening a towel on the rack. After Jake finished the repair, they lingered in the living room, their conversation shifting to more personal topics. He told her about his divorce, how the relationship had unraveled after years of drifting apart. Sometimes two people just stop seeing each other, Jake said, his voice tinged with regret. It's like you're living in the same house, but you're miles apart. Emma felt a pang of recognition. I know what you mean, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark works so much, I don't think he even notices when I'm upset anymore. Oh, Jake's gaze softened. That sounds hard. It is, Emma said, her vulnerability catching her off guard. She'd never voiced those feelings to anyone, not even her closest friends. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For what it's worth, you deserve to be seen, Emma. Really seen. Her breath hitched. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be with someone who looked at her the way Jake did now, with genuine care and attention. The thought sent a shiver through her, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Emma stood abruptly, breaking the moment. Can I get you something to drink? She asked, her voice wavering. Jake shook his head, sensing her unease. No, I should get going. Thanks for the coffee earlier. As he stood and gathered his tools, Emma felt a pang of disappointment. She followed him to the door, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Take care, Emma, Jake said, his voice soft but sincere. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to say more, then gave her a small smile and stepped outside. Emma watched him drive away, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in years, someone truly saw her. Emma sat on the edge of her bed that evening, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the dresser. Her mind replayed Jake's parting words, "Take care, Emma." They weren't just polite, they were thoughtful, intentional. She couldn't remember the last time Mark had spoken to her with such sincerity. She tried to shake the feeling, chalking it up to loneliness and the thrill of having someone pay attention to her. But it was more than that. Jake's words and his presence had awakened something she thought she'd lost. A part of her that longed to feel alive, wanted, and connected. The sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand pulled her from her thoughts. It was a message from Mark. Running late, don't wait up for dinner. She sighed and put the phone down without responding. His absence was nothing new, but tonight the emptiness felt heavier than usual. The following afternoon, Emma decided to get out of the house. She grabbed her keys and drove to a nearby farmer's market, hoping the bustle of people and fresh air would clear her mind. As she browsed the stalls, picking out ripe tomatoes and fragrant herbs, her thoughts drifted to Jake again. Suddenly, she spotted a familiar figure near a stand selling handmade wooden crafts. It was Jake, dressed casually in a fitted t-shirt and jeans. He was talking to the vendor, his smile as easy and warm as ever. Emma hesitated, unsure if she should approach him, but as if sensing her presence, Jake turned, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Emma," he said, stepping toward her, "fancy meeting you here." She laughed nervously, clutching her basket. "I needed to get out of the house. How about you?" "Same," Jake replied. "Figured I'd pick up a few things for the weekend. I've got my daughter coming over." Emma tilted her head, intrigued. "You never mentioned you had a daughter." Jake smiled, his expression softening. "Yeah, Lily, she's 8. Smart kid. Loves art and science. Makes me feel dumb half the time." Emma couldn't help but smile at the way he spoke about his daughter. There was a warmth and pride in his voice that made her heart ache in the best way. They walked together through the market, chatting about Lily and their shared love for cooking. Emma found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, her usual guard slipping away. It felt natural, easy, as if they'd known each other for years. When they reached the end of the market, Jake hesitated. "I was planning to grab a coffee at that little cafe down the street. You want to join me?" Emma froze. The invitation was innocent enough, but she knew it wasn't just coffee. It was a line, a choice. Her heart said yes, but her mind screamed at her to be careful. I don't think I should," she said, her voice faltering. "I mean, Mark." Jake nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with disappointment. "I get it. No pressure." Emma felt a pang of guilt as she watched him walk away. Part of her wanted to call out to him, to say she'd changed her mind. But she stayed rooted in place, torn between what she wanted and what was right. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, Jake's voice echoing in her mind, his laughter, his kindness, the way he had looked at her. It all felt so different from the cold, distant reality of her marriage. She thought about Mark, about the way they had drifted apart over the years. It wasn't just the long hours or the missed dinners. It was the lack of effort, the way he seemed to take her presence for granted. Somewhere along the line, they had stopped trying. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she reached for it, expecting another late-night text from Mark. Instead, it was a message from Jake. "Was good seeing you today. Take care of yourself, Emma." Her heart skipped a beat. It was just a text, but it felt like more. A reminder that someone cared, that someone noticed her. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to reply. Finally, she typed, "You too, Jake." It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the door open. The next day, Emma found herself in the backyard, pruning the overgrown rose bushes. She had always loved gardening. It was one of the few things that made her feel grounded. As she worked, she heard the faint hum of an engine pulling into the driveway. She stood, brushing the dirt off her hands, just as Jake's truck came into view. Her heart leapt, a mix of excitement and panic washing over her. Jake stepped out holding a small bag. "Hey!" "Hey," he called, his voice light. "I thought I'd drop off a part for the shower. Figured it might save you some trouble down the line." Emma smiled, though her pulse raced. "You didn't have to do that." Jake shrugged. "I wanted to." He handed her the bag, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. She felt her cheeks flush, but Jake didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let on. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft. They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. It wasn't awkward, but it was charged, as if both of them were waiting for the other to say something. Finally, Jake broke the silence. I should get going. I don't want to overstay my welcome." Emma nodded, her throat tight. "Right. Thanks again." As he turned to leave, Emma felt a surge of panic. She didn't want him to go, not yet. "Jake, wait," she blurted out. He stopped, turning back to her. "Yeah?" Emma hesitated, searching for the right words. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like you're living someone else's life?" Jake's expression softened. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. "All the time." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the rest of the world fell away. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly they were standing closer than they should have been, the space between them charged with unspoken feelings. Jake's hand brushed hers, lingering just long enough to send her heart racing. "Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with both hesitation and longing. "I know," she whispered, her own voice trembling. The moment passed, the weight of reality crashing back down around them. Jake took a step back, his expression conflicted. "I should go," he said, his voice barely audible. Emma nodded, watching as he climbed into his truck and drove away. Her heart ached, torn between the life she had and the life she was starting to imagine. The storm rolled in without warning. Heavy rain lashed against the windows, and thunder growled in the distance as Emma paced the kitchen. The power had flickered twice, and she realized with dread that the circuit breaker might trip soon. As she moved to grab a flashlight, the kitchen lights went out, plunging the house into darkness. She sighed, glancing at the flickering screen of her phone. She didn't want to bother Mark. He was busy, as always. But the idea of staying in the dark and dealing with the problem alone felt overwhelming. Before she could second-guess herself, she scrolled through her contacts and tapped Jake's number. "Hey, Emma," Jake answered, his voice steady despite the storm raging in the background. "Everything okay?" "Not really," she admitted, feeling both embarrassed and relieved to hear his voice. "The power's out and I think it's the breaker. I hate to ask, but would you mind helping me?" Jake didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 10. Emma exhaled, a mixture of gratitude and nerves swirling inside her. She lit a candle and set it on the kitchen counter, the flickering light casting shadows across the room. Her heartbeat quickened at the thought of seeing him again, especially under these circumstances. She told herself it was just practical. Jake knew how to fix things, and she needed the help, nothing more. True to his word, Jake arrived within 10 minutes. He was soaked from the rain, his jacket clinging to his broad shoulders, as he stepped into the dimly lit house. Emma handed him a towel, trying not to notice how the wet fabric of his shirt outlined his chest. "Thanks," he said, running the towel through his hair. "Breaker box is in the garage." Emma nodded, leading the way. The storm's ferocity made the house feel smaller, the sound of rain pounding on the roof, enveloping them in an almost intimate cocoon. She held the flashlight as Jake crouched in front of the breaker box, his hands moving with practiced ease. "You've got a few trip switches," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Nothing serious. Shouldn't take long." Emma stood behind him, the light from the flashlight catching the sharp angles of his face. She felt a sudden urge to reach out, to touch the warmth and solidity of him, but she quickly shoved her hands into her pockets. "There," Jake said, flipping the last switch. The lights flickered back on, bathing the garage in brightness. He stood and turned to her, his face inches from hers. "All set." "Thank you," Emma said softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to still. The air between them was charged, heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Jake took a step closer, his gaze searching hers for permission. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "tell me to leave." She couldn't. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she found herself moving closer, her hand brushing against his. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, and before she could stop herself, she closed the gap between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was both hesitant and urgent, a collision of longing and restraint. Jake's hands found her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of exhilaration and guilt flooding her senses. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though his hands remained on her hips. Emma shook her head, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I didn't stop you." They stood there in the garage, the storm raging outside as they grappled with the implications of what had just happened. Emma knew she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, but in that moment she didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Jake lingered for a while, helping Emma secure the house against the storm. They worked in near silence, the tension between them palpable. When the rain finally eased, Jake grabbed his jacket and turned to Emma. "Oh, I should go," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. Emma nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Thank you for everything." As he stepped outside, Jake hesitated, looking back at her one last time. "Take care, Emma." When the door closed behind him, the house felt impossibly empty. Emma leaned against the counter, her mind racing. She replayed the kiss over and over, her heart aching with both regret and longing. She knew she should feel ashamed, but all she could think about was the way Jake had looked at her, the way he had made her feel seen. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. Emma tried to immerse herself in her routine, but every quiet moment was filled with thoughts of Jake. She avoided his texts, afraid that responding would pull her deeper into a situation she wasn't ready to face. Mark's return only complicated matters. He came home late one night, his briefcase in hand and a tired smile on his face. "Hey, Em," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "Sorry for the late night. Big project at work." Emma forced a smile, her heart sinking at how distant he felt. "It's okay. Dinner's in the oven." They ate in near silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound in the room. Emma wanted to tell him about the storm, about how she had handled things while he was away, but the words felt hollow. She realized with a pang that she no longer sought his validation. She didn't even know if she wanted it. That night, as Mark snored softly beside her, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The kiss with Jake had been a turning point, a moment that forced her to confront the cracks in her marriage. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. One afternoon, Jake showed up unannounced. Emma opened the door, her heart racing as she saw him standing on the porch. his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said. She stepped aside, letting him in. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension as they sat across from each other in the living room. "I can't stop thinking about you," Jake admitted, his voice raw. "But I don't want to mess up your life." "Who's Jake?" he asked casually, though his tone carried an edge. Anna froze, the knife still in her hand. "He's the plumber. He helped with some repairs while you were away." Mark frowned, holding up the phone. "Then why is he texting you, 'Let me know if you need anything, Emma'? Sounds pretty personal for a plumber." Her heart raced. She snatched the phone from him, her hands trembling. "He's just being polite. He's a nice guy." Mark's eyes narrowed. "A nice guy who seems awfully interested in my wife." "You're overreacting," she said quickly, trying to deflect his suspicion. "It's nothing." But Mark wasn't convinced. "Nothing? You've been distant lately, Emma. I know I've been busy, but I've felt it. And now this?" Emma's emotions boiled over. The weight of her guilt, her resentment, and her longing for connection all crashed down at once. "Maybe if you were actually present in this marriage, I wouldn't need to talk to someone else," she snapped. Mark blinked, taken aback. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means you're never here, Mark." Emma's voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. "You bury yourself in work, and I'm left here alone. You don't see me anymore? You don't even try." Mark's face darkened. "So what, you run to the first guy who gives you attention? That's your solution?" "I didn't plan this," Emma shouted, her voice trembling. "But I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I'm lonely, Mark. I've been lonely for years." The room fell silent, the sound of their breathing heavy in the stillness. Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen. "So, is there something going on with him? With this Jake?" Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She could lie, but the truth was already clawing its way out. "It's complicated." Mark stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. "Complicated," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "That's not an answer, Emma." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "We kissed," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stared at her, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "You kissed him," he said, his voice rising. "Unbelievable." Emma felt the weight of her confession pressing down on her, but she didn't back down. "I'm not proud of it, Mark, but I needed someone, to remind me I'm still alive." Mark laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "So, that's it? You just give up on us and look for validation somewhere else?" "I'm not the only one who gave up," Emma shot back. "You've been married to your job for years. Mark, I've been here, waiting for you to notice me, to care, but you never did." Mark slammed his fist on the counter, making Emma flinch. "Don't you dare put this all on me. I work my ass off to provide for us, and this is how you repay me?" "It's not about money," Emma yelled, her voice breaking. "It's about us, about being partners, being connected. And we haven't been that in a long time." So the confrontation spilled into the living room, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Mark demanded answers, pressing her for details about Jake, about how far things had gone. Emma held her ground, refusing to reveal more than she already had. "It was a kiss," she said firmly. "That's all." Mark didn't believe her. "Do you think I'm an idiot? That I'm just going to take your word for it?" "I'm telling you the truth, Mark," Emma said, her voice weary. "But you're so caught up in your own anger that you won't hear it." Mark's phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. He glanced at the screen, then back at Emma. "I don't even know what to do with this right now," he said, grabbing his keys. "I need some air." Emma watched as he stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. The weight of everything, her guilt, her resentment, her longing, felt unbearable. Hours later, Mark returned, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word as he walked past her and into the bedroom. Emma followed, her heart pounding. "Mark," she began, her voice soft. "I'm sorry." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and anger. I don't know if I can forgive this, Emma. I don't know if I want to." Her chest tightened. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice trembling. "But we both let this happen. We stopped trying, Mark. And I think we owe it to ourselves to figure out why." Mark stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I deserve your trust, but I want to fix this, if you do too." The silence stretched between them, the weight of their broken marriage hanging in the air. Mark finally sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "I don't know, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know." One evening, as Mark sat in the living room, Emma joined him, placing a cup of tea on the table. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Mark," she said quietly, "I know I hurt you, and I know it's going to take time to rebuild what we lost, but I'm willing to try if you are." Mark looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I don't know if we can go back to how things were." Emma met his gaze, her voice steady. "Maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe we're supposed to figure out something new." For the first time in weeks, Mark gave her a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The days passed slowly, the tension between Emma and Mark lingering like a shadow over the house. While they tried to settle into a fragile routine, it was clear that things had shifted. They spoke less, their conversations limited to logistics and polite exchanges. Emma felt the weight of her choices in every silence, every sideways glance from Mark. But beneath the awkwardness, there was something else, a faint glimmer of hope. Mark had stayed. He hadn't packed a bag and walked out. That had to mean something, didn't it? One morning, Emma stood in the kitchen stirring her coffee when a knock at the door startled her. Her stomach dropped as she peeked out the window. It was Jake. She hesitated, her heart pounding. She hadn't responded to his texts, hoping he'd take the hint. But now, here he was, standing on her porch, with an expression that was equal parts concerned and determined. "Emma," Jake said when she opened the door. His voice was soft but firm. "Can we talk?" Emma glanced over her shoulder, paranoid that Mark might appear at any moment. "Jake, now's not a good time." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I just need to know where we stand. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that she couldn't either, that his presence had awakened something in her she hadn't felt in years. But that wasn't fair. Not to Mark, and not to herself. "Jake, I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "It's over." His face fell, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. But then he nodded, stepping back. "If that's what you want, "It's what I need," Emma said, though the words felt like they were tearing her apart. Jake lingered for a moment longer, as if searching for something in her eyes. When he found no encouragement, he turned and walked away. Emma closed the door, leaning against it as tears streamed down her face. It felt like she'd lost something precious, but she also knew it was the only way forward. That evening, Mark came home earlier than usual. He was quiet, as he had been for weeks, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, an openness that hadn't been there before. Over dinner, Emma finally gathered the courage to speak. "I saw Jake today," she said, her voice steady. Mark froze, his fork hovering over his plate. "And?" "I told him it's over," Emma said, "that I'm choosing us." Mark set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. "Why now?" Emma met his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. "Because I realized that I don't want to throw away everything we've built. I want to fight for us, Mark, but I can't do it alone." He studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Neither can I." The weeks that followed were tentative but promising. Mark and Emma started seeing a counselor, their sessions raw and uncomfortable at times, but necessary. For the first time in years, they began to unpack the layers of resentment, neglect, and misunderstanding that had built up between them. "I felt invisible," Emma confessed during one session, her voice breaking, "like I didn't matter to you anymore." Mark's jaw tightened, and he nodded. "And I felt like no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough, like I was failing you." The counselor guided them through their pain, helping them find common ground. It wasn't easy, and there were days when they questioned whether it was worth it, but slowly they began to rebuild. Not the marriage they'd had before, but something new, something more honest. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, Mark turned to Emma, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about us, about everything." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "And I know things won't ever be the same," he said, "but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we needed this to wake us up." Emma nodded, her throat tight. "I want us to be better, Mark. Not just for each other, but for ourselves." Mark reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll get there, together." For the first time in months, Emma felt a flicker of hope. But the road to healing was far from smooth. There were moments when the pain of the past resurfaced, when Mark's trust wavered, and when Emma doubted her ability to move forward. Jake's memory lingered in the back of her mind, a reminder of the choices she had made and the person she didn't want to become again. She found herself pouring her energy into self-discovery, reading, journaling, and even picking up yoga. For too long, she had defined herself by her roles as a wife and homemaker. Now she was determined to rediscover who she was outside of those identities. Mark noticed the change. He began making more of an effort to be present, to show Emma that she mattered. He surprised her with date nights, took time off work to spend with her, and even helped around the house without being asked. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Emma tended to her garden, Mark joined her, kneeling beside her in the dirt. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Roses," she said, smiling. "They're resilient. They can survive almost anything if you take care of them." Mark nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, kind of like us. Emma looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Exactly. They worked side by side, their hands dirty and their laughter filling the air. It wasn't the life Emma had imagined, but it was real. And for the first time in years, it felt like enough. As the months passed, the memory of Jake began to fade. Emma would always carry the lessons of that time with her, the reminder of her own needs, the importance of connection, and the power of choice. But she no longer felt the ache of what might have been. She had chosen her path, and she was determined to walk it with integrity. One evening, as she and Mark sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reached for her hand. "I'm proud of us," he said quietly. Emma smiled, squeezing his hand. "Me too." The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but they were facing it together, and for Emma, that was enough.